Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Peter Goodman, the global economics correspondent for the New York Times, based in London, who was previously the New York Times national economic correspondent, where he played a leading role in the paper's award-winning coverage of the Great Recession, including a series that was a Pulitzer finalist. He also served as Washington Post China-based Asian economics correspondent and is the author of Past Due, The End of Easy Money and the Renewal of the American Economy, and his latest book just out is Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World. Welcome to Background Briefing, Peter.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. And in many ways, it seems that we are sort of going back to a kind of feudal age in a global sense, where you've got this vast roiling underclass across the world, comprising 99.9999% of the world's population. And then you got a thin sliver above them of the kind of wealth protection industry of lawyers and accountants. And then sitting atop that is a handful of billionaires. Oxfam just came out with a report on the eve of Davos that the world's 10 richest men have more than doubled their collective fortunes since March of 2020. So is that a reasonable way to look at this new feudalism?
I think, unfortunately, that is a reasonable way to look at it. And, that Oxfam report was both stunning and entirely unsurprising. I mean, none of this is by accident. This is the biggest takeaway, I hope, intended from my book, that this is the result of a system that's been engineered by a handful of billionaires. This is not happenstance. They have engineered this through their lawyers and their lobbyists, and they're paid for members of Congress and other legislators around the world. And it's a fashion that has worked very well for them, where they dismantle public infrastructure, they downgrade government programs, government services, and then they take the proceeds and they transfer them to themselves through tax cuts. They defenestrate antitrust enforcement, which leaves us vulnerable to price increases while they're fattening their margins. And then when government doesn't work, they double down and they say, government's so inefficient, we may as well just eliminate programs altogether. The punchline to this we saw last year in Davos. Well, it was virtual Davos, when Mark Benioff, who's the CEO of Salesforce, now worth about $10 billion, literally said, CEOs are the heroes of the pandemic. The government didn't save you. We did. And we did it not for profit, but to save the world. He was talking about, COVID vaccines and financial firms unleashing credit in the middle of a pandemic. And one could be tempted to say, well, that wasn't a good thing to say. That's backfired on him. It's like a gaffe. But it really isn't. It's a worldview. It's a fully formed worldview of the people who have rigged the system for their own benefit while, going far beyond the robber barons of the last century. They want our adulation for being the good guys, and they use it as a prophylactic against the redistribution of wealth.
So how could Benioff not noticed that it was the U.S. federal government that financed the research for the vaccines and allowed the private companies to take the profits, and then the U.S. government in turn has bought the vaccines and distributed them?
Well, and it's even worse than that, right? Because take Pfizer, where Albert Bourla has actually told us publicly, he's the CEO of Pfizer. This is a guy who's a multimillionaire. They took the fruits of, in some cases, publicly financed research. They ginned up vaccines in record time, and thank goodness for that, right? Props to them, props to the researchers who did that work. But then they sold those vaccines around the world to the highest bidder to maximize returns for shareholders, which, of course, invites variants like Omicron. It puts us in a situation where you have frontline medical workers in parts of Africa and South Asia who are treating COVID patients with no protection, while in places like the United States and the UK, we're giving out booster shots, we're vaccinating kids. It's an invitation to Omicron, and the only conclusion there that's reasonable is that we, society, is subsidizing the profit for the shareholders of Pfizer, paying through the perpetuation of the pandemic, increased death, destruction of livelihoods, the trashing of our kids' education as schools remain shut. I mean, that's that structure we've seen again and again during the pandemic.
And again, I'm speaking with Peter Goodman, the global economics correspondent for the New York Times, who was previously the New York Times' national economics correspondent, where he played a leading role in the paper's award-winning coverage of the Great Recession, including a series that was a Pulitzer finalist. He also served as Washington Post's China-based Asian economics correspondent and is the author of Past Due, The End of Easy Money and the Renewal of the American Economy. And his latest book, just out, is Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World. Well, you've profiled in your book Mark Benioff, the guy that wears Hawaiian shirts, and his offices have in the tallest building in San Francisco. And what is he called? His golden retriever that walks around with him?
Chief Love Officer.
His love officer. Okay.
Chief Love Officer. Refers to the company as Ohana. He's co-opted a Hawaiian term for kinship.
So he's a touchy-feely capitalist.
I mean, he's a touchy-feely capitalist, but, let's give Benioff his due. I actually find him the most complex of the 5 Davos men I profile because, by all accounts, he's serious about philanthropy. I mean, he's not just a guy who puts his name on a building. He is somebody who will write a check for homeless services. He financed a ballot initiative in San Francisco that's increased taxes on big tech companies like his to increase services. And he did during the pandemic, the first wave of the pandemic, that is, pull his connections in China to go and secure things like face masks and gowns and hand sanitizer for frontline medical workers who were lacking that stuff in the U.S. and distributed that. He's now taken a bow for that. But this raises a bunch of questions. First of all, why are we dependent upon the largesse of a tech bro in the midst of the worst pandemic in a century to outfit our frontline medical workers in what's supposedly the richest, most powerful country on earth? And the $10 million that he put into this ballot initiative in San Francisco is like a rounding error alongside the modest sum of zero that he paid in federal taxes as a company on several billion dollars in revenues, not once, but twice. And again, that doesn't happen by accident. That happens through Benioff's participation in the Business Roundtable, led at the time by Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, who helped deliver the Trump tax cuts worth $1.5 trillion, lavished primarily on Davos men like Jamie Dimon and Mark Benioff.
And this wouldn't have happened except that during the Clinton administration, the Treasury then allowed these corporations to ship their intellectual property to a place like Ireland, where they could then domicile their corporations and pay little to no tax and not be responsible for the fact that they live and profit here in the United States. And the Oxfam report lists the 10 richest men in America: Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bernard Arnault, of course, is the exception there. The rest are American: Bill Gates, Larry Ellison, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Ballmer, and Warren Buffett. And collectively, there are 2,660 billionaires around the world with a combined wealth of $13.76 trillion. Shall I read the wealth of the top 5 here in the United States?
Sure.
Okay. Elon Musk, $294.2 billion. Jeff Bezos, $202.6 billion. Bill Gates, $137.4 billion. Larry Ellison, $125.7 billion. And Larry Page, $122.8 billion. And you profile Bezos in your book, Peter Goodman, Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World. He doesn't seem to be particularly philanthropic. He'd rather loft into space, right, than deal with worldly problems.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm very careful in the book to note that we don't want to demonize billionaires, or certainly not business people in general, right? I mean, Bezos is a certifiable genius who has executed tremendously on this vision for what he calls the everything store. He's revolutionized how we buy products. It would be very hard to go back to life before e-commerce for most of us now that we've gotten a taste of that convenience. And I think, one can rightfully say, well, okay, so he makes a whole lot more than everybody else. That's just how it is in a capitalist economy. But it's not simply that he's making out dramatically well while, the inequality is just inescapable, while workers in his warehouses are deprived of basic protective gear during the first wave of the pandemic. When one of them protests and leads a walkout, a guy named Christian Smalls in Staten Island, he's fired officially for violating quarantine, which is incredibly ironic considering that he actually wants a quarantine for everyone. He wants everyone to go home and have there be paid sick leave until we can guarantee that the warehouse is safe. And Amazon has lobbied systematically against paid sick leave for years, and they're certainly not going to make an exception there. It's not that Bezos is doing really well and Christian Small and his colleagues are doing less well. It's that Bezos is doing well because Christian Small and his colleagues are not doing well. His fortune is dependent upon perverting international trade, for one thing, diverting the gains of modern capitalism. I mean, the U.S. has benefited dramatically from globalization, but the gains haven't been distributed equitably. People like Smalls have been deprived of a piece of the action. And then even when all this breaks and it becomes a huge public relations scandal for Amazon, Bezos, very Davos man here, doubles down and actually attacks the messenger. First of all, Vice News breaks the fact that the general counsel of Amazon suggests that they train their attention in terms of PR on Smalls, who's an African-American guy reared in Newark, says in notes that Vice News obtains that, well, he's not very smart, he's not very articulate. To the extent we can make the movement about him will benefit. And then Bezos releases a note. Dear Amazonians, yes, it's true. We don't have enough PPE. We're working on that. But thank you, you selfless workers, for continuing to do the Lord's work of trying to outfit the rest of society in a pandemic, and claims that they're prioritizing important goods that are saving other people's grandmothers, like, hand sanitizer, masks, et cetera. At the same time that Smalls and his coworkers are putting those things into these boxes, they don't have their own. And Smalls, by the way, says that's not even true. He tells me, oh, actually, we're just putting the same stuff as usual. Sex toys, baking goods, video game consoles. So the cynicism, while all of these guys were taking a bow, Bezos was a signatory the year before to this much ballyhooed new statement of a purpose of a corporation, the thing that's supposed to usher in stakeholder capitalism, where companies are not just catering to the bottom line, a la Milton Friedman. They're now catering to stakeholders, social concerns, labor, communities. He signs this pledge, and then that's how Smalls and the other warehouse workers are treated. And then Bezos blasts himself into space at a cost of $5 billion, which would have been enough to vaccinate the world multiple times over, even if we're paying monopoly royalties to Pfizer and the other pharmaceutical companies.
But I think the worst thing of all, though, Peter Goodman, is he doesn't pay taxes. And isn't that just simple greed? I mean, the other guy you mentioned, Benioff, doesn't pay taxes neither. At least his company doesn't. This is where I think it's extraordinary. And, back in the Eisenhower days, when that was considered the golden age of the American dream, what was the 94%, 92% was the tax rate from the...
Yeah,
so
right.
These people don't want to... I mean, there's a new phenomenon being coined by the Harvard political scientist Jacob Hacker.
Yeah.
Plutocratic populism, and Trump is the epitome of that. And it seems to me that the plutocrats are actually incredibly clever to be able to have this vast wealth that nobody can touch, not pay taxes, benefit from everything the government does in many ways. I mean, Elon Musk was subsidized by the government initially, and yet not pay their taxes, and then be able to get the working people in this country divided over stupid things like culture wars and fighting amongst themselves while they laugh all the way to the bank.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, this cynicism from Davos, man, about Trump. I mean, I was at Davos in January of 2018 when Trump shows up. And the conventional wisdom, like the way it was packaged by most of us in the press, was this titillation that, well, as I describe it in my book, we're supposed to react as if, a guy who runs a topless barbecue joint is showing up at a solemn gathering of Talmudic scholars, because Davos, man, is supposed to care about international cooperation. Davos, man, is offended by misogyny and racism, and Trump is threatening to blow up the liberal world order. He's yanked the U.S. out of the Paris climate change agreement. But the truth is, Davos is really dominated by giant tech companies, consulting companies, finance firms. These are the people who pay the bills, and they don't care very much about like the official program, which is full of all kinds of earnest discussions about important issues of the day. They're spending their time at cocktail parties, banquets. I mean, billionaires are going to Davos and they're like engaging in simulations of the Syrian refugee experience by day, being led around in the dark while people are screaming at them in language that they don't understand, demanding papers, patting themselves on the back for going through this torture, and then going and having, caviar champagne underwritten by global banks. I mean, that's the reality at Davos. And those guys could see through Trump. I mean, okay, they would tell you, well, we prefer that he not threaten to renounce the American national debt like it's some debt to Deutsche Bank from some failing casino. We could live without that. That could make the market unhappy. But we can see what's going to happen. We're going to get tax cuts. We're going to get deregulation. And in 2018, they had just gotten the biggest tax cuts they could have ever imagined. So he was, in fact, really a hero. And I think, to your point about the unfairness of taxation, most of these billionaires are paying a much smaller share of even their income than the people who are scrubbing their toilets. I mean, that's based on academic work by Gabriel Zucman and Emmanuel Saez at Berkeley. And the worst part of it is how they've saturated our discourse with this idea that taxation is somehow evil. So, you mentioned that top tax rates in the U.S. used to be, well above 70% into the 90s, at times when the American economy was growing robustly, and truly everybody was getting a piece of the action. And yet, I would say, this is anecdotally, the average American, even people who would say, oh, I wish we had, better health care. I wish it were cheaper to send my kids to college. I wish infrastructure wasn't embarrassing. They would still say, well, we can't afford healthcare. We'd have to pay too much in taxes. And people have internalized this idea that taxation is the enemy of innovation, which is totally a false binary served up by Davos man through think tanks, through lobbyists, where he's convinced us that we can either accept monopoly profits for vaccines, or we get no vaccines at all. We either have Steve Schwarzman of Blackstone investing in our healthcare, diminishing it, shutting down hospital beds. I mean, as happened throughout the healthcare industry in the decades running up to the pandemic, or we don't have any healthcare at all. And all of these false binaries are what make it so difficult to do the fairly simple things. They're not simple in execution. Davos man's got quite an apparatus to fight off change, but they're pretty simple in terms of prescription: progressive taxation, labor rights, antitrust enforcement. Again, you pull off those three things, we could solve a lot of problems.
So just in the last couple of minutes then, Peter Goodman, how does Davos man and the 10 richest Americans that Oxfam named, or, well, 9, I guess, and, there's some talk of a global wealth tax, etc., but I don't see Biden can't even get anything through his own caucus.
Nothing. We've got
Manchin and Sinema, so forget about that. But at the end of the day, we are heading into a kind of one-party state. The Republicans are rigging the elections to the extent that we could end up like GOP, Trump's GOP, I might add, could end up like Putin's United Russia, and we can have a kind of pseudo-democracy. That's where we're heading. So how does Davos man and the billionaires feel about that? Do they want to live in a one-party Republican state?
I don't think Davos man cares very much about the political configuration or the ideology. These are like talking points in the service of his own fortune. I mean, Davos man loves free markets when that means he can do what he wants and doesn't have to be regulated. He's all for state intervention when he can get his hands on taxpayer-financed bailouts in emergencies, or when he can craft what bailouts are there to prop up his own assets. Davos man believes in Davos man, and so we don't have to give a lot of thought to how the billionaire class views the political system. Moreover, just look at how the billionaire class has experienced the pandemic. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things that Benioff said, this was back in April of 2020, he went on Jim Cramer's TV show, and he said, I'm paraphrasing, the the pandemic has been this great unifier. We're all experiencing it together. We're all human. We're all vulnerable to this virus. It's a race to the illusion, he said, the illusion of our borders. Somebody who actually works at Salesforce tweeted at me recently that you should know that Salesforce actually gets pretty significant revenues from ICE, for whom I assure you the borders are in no way illusory. But you think about this. I mean, Benioff at the time is riding out the pandemic in his oceanfront mansion on the Big Island of Hawaii, or maybe it's his $28 million residence overlooking San Francisco Bay. I can't recall. We've got Steve Schwarzman hosting dinner parties in the Hamptons, giving people rapid tests to be guests at a time when New York City public schools can't open because nobody has any tests. Nobody has any idea how COVID is spreading. I mean, this idea that we're all united is belied immediately by a simple observation about who has to go work in a slaughterhouse, who has to empty a bedpan in a nursing home, who can and cannot work from home. Zoom. And of course, even the white collar people who do have that privilege, and it's quite a privilege compared to those who lack it, are still dealing with, kids out of school, childcare is unavailable, fear, relatives in the hospital. I mean, the idea that we're all one through this is just kind of tragically hilarious. And so the idea that Davos man will stop and give a thought to the implications of the state of democracy. I mean, Davos man's been taking this as an opportunity to buy private islands, to add to his fleet of private jets, to add new residences, and to buy up assets at distressed prices. Schwartzman's buying more healthcare. He's buying more warehouses that he's leasing to Amazon. Benioff has seen his net worth, swell past $10 billion because Salesforce makes the software that we're using to work from home. Bezos is richer than ever because we're all buying stuff on Amazon, and Jamie Dimon has been celebrating J.P. Morgan Chase's record earnings from investment banking fees. It's just very difficult to imagine that these guys are shedding a tear for the fate of democracy when they're the ones who've actually perverted democracy and left us susceptible to these right-wing opportunists who come along and prescribe wacko solutions to very real problems.
Well, Peter Goodman, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you. Appreciate your interest.
And again, I've been speaking with Peter Goodman, who's the global economics correspondent for the New York Times based in London, and previously was the New York Times national economics correspondent, where he played a leading role in the paper's award-winning coverage of the Great Recession, including a series that was a Pulitzer finalist. He also served as Washington Post China-based Asian economics correspondent and is the author of Past Due, The End of Easy Money and the Renewal of the American Economy. And his latest book just out is Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back looking into the links between privatization and the undermining of rights, freedom, and